Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So glad you could join us for the Grief Healing Telesummit. Top experts share their best holistic healing methods to transform grief into healing and living again. My name is Chelsea Hansen, your host, founder of With Sympathy Gifts and Keepsakes, as well as Global Grace, the World Association of Spiritual Grief Healing. We have a very special guest today, Ashley Davis Bush. Ashley is the author of Transcending Loss, Understanding the Lifelong Impact of Grief and How to Make It Meaningful. And it's really a classic book on this topic. And I know the book has had a profound impact on me as well as many other people. So she'll be talking to us about that today. But let me just give you a little bit of her background and we'll get Ashley on the call for you. Ashley is a psychotherapist with over 20 years of experience of working with grievers. She is the author of several self-help books, including the classic Transcending Loss, which I just talked about, and that was published over 17 years ago already. Ashley is also a Huffington Post blogger and the radio host for Embracing Change on webtalkradio.net. Welcome, Ashley.
Hi, Chelsea. It's a real pleasure to be talking with you.
Yeah, we are so glad you could join us. And you are going to be talking to us about transcendence and making meaning out of loss. But maybe you could tell us a little first how you got involved in your line of work as far as psychotherapy and helping grievers and that kind of thing.
Sure, I'd love to. I was actually very fortunate that at basically an early stage in my career, I was in my late 20s, I realized that the work I was doing was not particularly meaningful for me, and I was working in public relations at the time. And I felt that there was some purpose for me that I hadn't quite discovered. And I was actually in New Mexico and had a literal mountaintop experience. I was on a mountain in New Mexico, and I had been praying and meditating and trying to get clear on what my purpose was in being on the planet. And I basically got a very clear message that I needed to be a therapist and that in particular needed to work with grievers. And so it was an actual calling, a spiritual calling for me. I went back home after that event and I enrolled in social work school and I was on my way. And in fact, my very first client when I was a student and I was in an internship residency program, the very first client I was assigned to was a grief situation where a woman's sister had been murdered and she was coming for grief counseling. So it's like I was just thrown in right away and it felt so right and it just clicked. I just knew instantly, yes, this is why I'm here. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. I've also always loved writing and I've been a writer, like in a journal my whole life, basically as early as I could write. And so it just all kind of came together that I realized I was being called on this path to do this work and to help other grievers.
That is awesome, especially for us who can enjoy the impact of your work. And we are having you be basically at the end of our telesummit simply because your book is Transcending Loss, like the lifelong impact of grief.
Yes.
So
yes, and it's really a different stage. You're right. So that's very appropriate for me to be toward the end of your series because transcendence is something that comes over time for most people. It's not the immediate sense where you're, obviously in the beginning, I'm sure you've talked about this with some of your speakers, that you've got that shock and often denial and working through that initial trauma. So transcendence is something different. It's something that starts to unfold over time.
Yeah, and kind of explain to us, like some of the myths, like the poor person who's grieving, people are suggesting closure to the person. Explain that to us, that's really not how it works.
No, it would. It's funny. I was about to say in some ways that would be nice, but in fact it wouldn't be nice because if you had complete closure on the emotional experience of grieving, you would also have to have closure on any connection to the person you loved and lost. And as you know, we stay very connected, and that's part of transcendence as well. So the fact that grief is a lifelong process has a pro, or a silver lining, if you will, that it also keeps you connected, and that if you were to close the experience of grief, you would close the whole relationship. So, of course, in our society, it's not just our friends and family, it's the whole culture. We love the idea of closure. We love the idea of a quick fix. We love the idea of moving on. And that's just not the reality. And even now in the media, I will sometimes hear how some event is going to help bring closure to a griever. Or some people will even say that the funeral brings closure, which, of course, is a bizarre idea because the funeral is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the process that is to come. Now, it may bring healing, and there are levels of healing, but healing is different than closure because some people will say if I just, could go to the grave site. Maybe they haven't been able to go there, and then they think if I can just go to the grave site, I'll have closure. They won't have closure, but they might have some kind of a healing or some kind of a connection experience. So that's possible. But closure itself as an idea that we will be done with the grief, that the process will be completed, that it will be over, and we can go back to normal, that is just a complete fabrication and a myth. And the reality is much more complex, as I'm sure you know, that there's a whole integration process that needs to occur. But even in the mental health field, there used to be this idea that grief was a 2-week process. The idea of grief being a 2-week process is just so laughable, so ludicrous. But there's this sort of fervent hope that closure will mean the end of pain. So that's, I think, in the end what people want when they wish for closure for their loved ones or even wish for closure for themselves. They just want the pain to stop. And the pain will change, that's for sure, but it's going to be an integration process, not a process of closure.
Yeah, I know. I feel so bad for the grievers when we get these messages given to us through society, of course, this being one of them, the closure, the moving on.
Yes, and also a sense that you're going to somehow go back to being your old self. When are you going to go back to normal? And it's sometimes hard to wrap your mind around the fact that it's a new normal and a new self that's unfolding, that you're not going to go back to being your old self, that has really changed, that you have changed forever.
And then tell everyone, the favorite thing for me about your book was really you're giving yourself permission to be like, yes, this relationship is not over. It's simply a new type of relationship. And I know you say a new relationship through memory, spirit, and love. So it's finally the bereaved person has permission, I thought, against the messages that we're really getting from society. So tell us how to cultivate this relationship.
Well, yes. Well, first, let's just to back that up, this idea of what society tells people. And often it's really this idea somehow that you're going to forget them, or that you shouldn't remember them, or you shouldn't talk to them out loud, or you shouldn't bring them up in the middle of parties, or that somehow you shouldn't keep their pictures around in your home. In fact, I worked with a woman whose daughter had died, and she wanted to keep pictures up at her place of employment. She had sort of a cubicle situation, and she had pictures of her deceased daughter all around her desk. And her boss called her in and said, your colleagues are a little upset that the pictures of your daughter are still around your desk. We'd like to ask you to take them down. And it was such a bracing moment for her where she realized she was not getting support in staying connected to her daughter. In fact, she was being penalized for it. In the end, she left that position, which was the better choice for her. But yeah, there's just this sort of sense that you shouldn't hold on. You need to let go. You need to move on. And what I tell people I work with is that you're going to move forward, but you're going to bring your loved one with you. It's not a matter of moving on and forgetting, moving on and erasing them somehow, as if you could erase their memory, erase them from your life, erase them from your heart. This isn't possible, and it's not even desirable. So it often is a case of going against sometimes an avalanche of people's influence. Unless you're around other grievers who understand, which is why group support can be so important, online support is so important, to be with other people who do, in fact, understand that it is important to preserve the love, to preserve the connection. Because when I was saying that you're changed forever by the loss and by the grief, it's also important to remember that you're changed forever for having known them at all. Just because you loved them, just because you knew them and they were in your life and you had the privilege of having their love for you, you are different because you loved as well as because you've lost.
Yeah, I know. That's such a lovely thought. It's so comforting. And what do you suggest for the grievers who do, well, I guess for this lady, for example, this unfortunately happens a lot where people get comments that just aren't helpful. How can we, educate the people we want in our lives to help us? Of course, in this situation, she didn't probably want to be at this job anymore, but the people we want in our lives, what can we tell to them?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chelsea, because I think that ultimately grievers have the potential to be educators. It's sort of the job they didn't want. But now that you're grieving, how can you educate people? And I think that being defensive and being angry in general doesn't help. So sort of, as I say, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. In general, when you approach people with sort of a defensive, angry, hostile way, it's almost an immediate invitation for that person to shut down. But when you approach people with kind of an open heart and a sense of, I'm going to help you I'm going to help try to teach you this because I know you don't understand. And to remember that people who don't understand, it's not because they're trying to be mean or they're trying to be antagonistic. Usually when they say things like maybe you need to move on or maybe you need to forget, it's because they have so much trouble tolerating your pain and their own discomfort. It doesn't mean they're evil people or mean or nasty people. So you just have to remember they simply don't understand. They're ignorant because they haven't had to go through this. They just don't know yet. So you want to approach people with this sort of spirit of, I recognize that you don't know because you haven't had to learn this yet, but I'm going to tell you my experience. And if you can keep it in that vein, this is my experience, and the other grievers I know, it's their experience. It seems to be a common experience, and I just want to share with you that, in fact, the healthiest thing I can do is to continue to keep these pictures up. The healthy way for me is to remember and to hold the love in my heart. You can cite research. You can cite books. You can say, I read in this book, Transcending Loss, that it's much healthier to maintain connection and not try to sever the connection. But you want to do it in a way that's just, I know you wouldn't know this because you haven't had to know it, but this is my experience, this is other people's experience, this is what I read, and that when you think about it, love is eternal. Love doesn't die. And so, of course, I'm going to still be connected to them.
I know that is, again, such a nice thought. Now, tell me, let me back up just a second. You know how we're educating the people around us to help us? Can you enlighten me or enlighten the listeners? What happened, in our Western society that so many people are uneducated about loss and death?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I completely have the answer to that, but I do know that other cultures are a little more adaptable with that. They are able to tolerate tears, for example. There might be more emotion that can be tolerated and expressed. You know, I guess I would have to say it must have something to do with our forefathers, the pilgrims that came to, you know, settle America. They had to be very industrious, they were hard workers, and they had kind of, I guess, a stiff upper lip in order to survive. This sort of Puritan work ethic. They had to come here, they had to work, and there wasn't a lot of room for expression and reflection. You know, they were basically trying to survive in a potentially hostile land, hostile both from Native American Indians, who rightfully would be hostile as someone comes to take their land, and also hostile in the sense of the climate, the harsh New England winters. And I mean, I live in New England, and I sometimes think about, oh my gosh, those pilgrims, they came here and lived in little wood cabins that were unheated. I mean, I can't imagine trying to survive without the modern conveniences. But the point is, there was something about the forefathers and mothers who settled this country that created a climate where we had to be tough and we had to be sort of stoic and puritanical. And that has translated, hundreds of years later into a culture that doesn't easily make room for sadness, for expressions of emotion. Even I think of JFK when he was killed, and Jackie Kennedy was very stoic, and everyone praised her for being so strong. And often strength is equated with shutting down emotion, holding it together. If she had wept and moaned and fallen down on the ground, which would have all been very appropriate, I don't think people would have praised her. They would have said, oh my God, she's falling apart. This is terrible. So we just have this deeply ingrained sense that you've got to hold it together, when in fact, quite the reverse is more a sign of strength, in my opinion, that it actually, shutting down emotion is only one kind of strength, and it really has to do with avoidance and resistance. Allowing true emotion to run its course, to have the strength to cry, to sob, to face your emotion full on, to let it ripple over you and go through you like an ocean wave and then recede. And not only that, but to even model it, to model it for children, to model it for friends, to say, it's okay for me to cry. This is how people process emotion. This is what is healthy. That's just a very different kind of message than we're used to seeing. But in fact, it's the stronger response to pain. And the other thing I wanted to mention, and this goes back to our discussion about educating people, is that you want to let people know, if this is true for you, that it's really helpful to share memories and to talk about whoever's gone, whether it's your father, your child, your spouse, your sibling, that in part of the education process, you can say to them, I love when you mention Tom. It's like a gift to me when you share a memory. Or, don't be afraid of mentioning Tom because you think I might start crying. Yes, I might start crying, and I love when you mention Tom because then I know he's not forgotten. So it's just a matter of sharing your experience again and letting people know that it's okay to cry, it's okay to feel, it's okay to remember, and that is part of healthy grieving.
And I was just wondering that, too, and you had brought it up about children, to model for them it's okay to process emotion and to have expression and reflection. What are, just a couple quick tips that you would suggest to help us with our kids to do this modeling? And I can give you an example.
Please do.
So in our family, I have a 7-year-old son. My parents are deceased. My husband's father is deceased. So we have a lot of loss around our family, but I want my son to know about his grandparents. So that's one example of, how should we introduce this so he knows what's happening. And just like everyday things that it's okay to cry. Like, what tips do you have?
Well, I would certainly say it's important to talk about Grandpa, or for you to share memories and say, when when I was growing up, this is something I used to do with my dad, and I always loved it. Or when I think about my mom, I remember blank. That you want to share memories, because these are memories that your children won't have because they don't know, in a way that they're not growing up with your parents. So sharing memories, sometimes it could be lighting a candle in memory of them, having sort of a memorial candle that either on special holidays or whenever it feels appropriate, you light this candle and say, I'm lighting this candle in memory of my father or my mother because their light is still so bright within me and I think of them. That can be something nice to do. Certainly when you do cry, saying, I just really miss my mom and dad, and sometimes I just feel like crying because I wish they were still here. Could also be visiting a gravesite or a memorial bench or anything that might be a physical sort of pilgrimage place. Looking at pictures, that's very important. Saying, let me show you some pictures of my dad and me when we were little. Just kind of normalizing the whole experience so that it doesn't feel like, you mentioned my dad. It should be a comfort level, almost a casual, comfortable sense of this person is very much a part of my heart and my life still, even though their form is no longer on the planet.
And then what do you do in the situation, say, you have like the generation there are people who are one generation older than you who are really deathly, no pun intended, but definitely afraid to talk about death. It's like taboo. You don't talk ill about the dead. You just, don't acknowledge what happened. So it's sometimes you'll have like two generations or two different views operating in one family. So again, is it more educating or trying to educate that older generation?
Yeah, that's a tricky situation there, Chelsea. It's true. Because you don't want to offend people. You don't want to push them to a place where they can't go. And let's say you have an aunt and she doesn't, I don't know that this would be true, but let's say your father had a sister and she's still alive, and so here you want to share stories and memories of your father, but she doesn't. She can't tolerate talking about her brother, let's say. So in that situation, I think you have to be respectful. Ultimately, you can't push it on a person. You can't force them to reminisce. You can't force them necessarily to go there. If their defenses and their resistance is so strong, there are probably a lot of reasons why that's so, and you single-handedly are not going to melt that for them, most likely. What you can do is drop in a phrase here and there. This reminds me of when Dad and I went fishing, and then watch them kind of stiffen and look horrified, and then you can just say, I think about him all the time, and I'm just so filled with my love for him, or I had a dream about him. So you can kind of drop them like little pebbles, I think, and see what the ripple effect is. But in the end, you don't want to steamroll someone and say, okay, we're going to watch a slideshow of my dad and make them just tormented. So you have to be sensitive, and you have to recognize that people do have different styles, and some people aren't as willing to be open, to be as free with their feelings and emotions, and maybe they have a lifetime of loss that they're sitting on, or other emotional issues going on where they just can't go there. And if that's the case, you just have to be respectful of it and find the places and the people with whom you can be more open.
And then tell us, when someone loses someone, how can they choose to make meaning out of their loss versus going the other direction, like feeling a lot of bitterness and anger and that kind of stuff? Tell us how to cultivate that conscious choice that we can make meaning out of loss.
Yes. Well, Chelsea, that was really a lot of the motivation when I first started writing Transcending Loss, and I interviewed a lot of people for that book, and that was kind of my burning question, the underlying template. Why is it that some people, upon having a major loss, get very bitter, they shut down, they close down, and other people seem to do the opposite. They grow through it, they make meaning from it, they go to a different place in their living. And the term transcendence literally means a rising up. It means almost like, I think of it as being on the top of a building, the top of the Empire State Building. And when you're that high up and you look out, you gain a very different perspective. You just see everything differently. And you can't really have that perspective unless you get up higher. So part of transcending is being able to get up a little higher, so to speak, so that you gain perspective on this loss as one piece in the puzzle of your life, and that you're able to, in that position of perspective, start to see things a little differently. And in terms of making meaning, in the book I talk about 4 specific ways that people make meaning intentionally, and all 4 of them, though, have to do with change. So I use an acronym SOAR, S-O-A-R, which stands for spirituality, outreach, attitude, and reinvestment. And those are ways that people can intentionally and consciously change in their lives as a result of the loss. So in answer to your question, how does one choose that? How do they make it happen? First, they have to recognize that it is a choice, that there is some intentionality to it, that you basically have to wrap your head around the idea that I don't want to become bitter from this. I don't want to shut down from this. In fact, I'm going to insist that I grow and change in some direction, almost to honor them, to honor the love, to honor their life, to say, this is going to matter, this will make a difference, even if it's in very subtle ways, in the ways that you approach life. So in the book, and one way of making meaning, of having a reinvestment is, say, starting a foundation that's in honor of your loved ones. So like the Make-A-Wish Foundation, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. These were started by bereaved parents. So that's a very dramatic scale where someone just says, I'm going to, change legislation. I'm going to start a foundation. I'm going to do this big thing. It doesn't have to be that big. Some people are inspired to do that. Some people are natural leaders and organizers and shakers, movers and shakers. But it doesn't have to be that scale. It can also be a very personal sense of my spirituality has deepened, or my attitude about life is much more don't sweat the small stuff. Even those subtle shifts are very powerful, and they're important ways of saying, I'm not going to have this loss be for nothing. I'm going to have a change, a ripple from the pebble, that it's happening because of the loss, and it's happening because I'm choosing to make it happen. And I think transcendence is a choice almost every single day. That it's not, there may be an initial shift, sort of like train tracks, you make that diversion and the train track turns to the right and now you're off on a different trajectory. So there's probably the initial giant shift of I'm waking up and I have to make a change. But then there are little daily choices and shifts that I think happen kind of on par with food, with nutrition. You don't just have one big meal and say, wow, I'm set. You have to eat every single day. In fact, you have to eat many, many times a day. And I think that with transcendence, you have to make that choice daily to say, I'm going to make this matter. I'm going to choose a different path. I'm not going to let my heart shrivel up over this. I'm not going to shut down and stop loving. I'm going to keep loving. And I heard a beautiful expression from a woman, there's a blog called Humans of New York. It's a very popular blog, and there's a book came out last year with pictures, photographs of a young man who goes out in New York City and takes pictures of people, and he hears their stories. So it's called Humans of New York. And he took a picture of an old elderly woman on a rainy day, Columbus Circle, and he was chatting with her, and he said, "Tell me about one of the most significant events of your life." And she said, "Well, it's when my husband died." And they had been married 50-something years. And she said, now I'm forgetting his name, but let's call it Joe. She said before he died, she said, "Joe, how am I going to go on without you when you die?" Because he'd been sick and they knew he was dying. And he said, "You're going to take all the love we've shared for all these many years, and you're going to spread it around." And I thought that was so beautifully put, that when you have a great deal of love from someone, when you've shared it, your task is to help spread it around, to let other people benefit from the love that you shared. And when you make that choice every single day, you keep your heart open and you make the loss matter.
That's lovely. And then tell us a little bit more, like in the SOAR model, you're talking about attitude as well. Explain that a little more to us, like the attitude of perspective or suffering or gratitude.
Could be all of that. Yes, it's very personal, but in my experience that people change the way they view life, and they usually change the way they view death. So gratitude could be part of the change towards life, that they're very grateful for every little thing that they no longer take for granted. It could be, as I mentioned before, the kind of don't sweat the small stuff, seeing that, okay, I have, a hamper full of dirty clothes, so what? I want to go spend a little time with my child and play, because they've just said, "Mommy, come play with me." And before I might have said, no, I have to do the laundry, but instead now I'm going to put it down and savor the moment. But I think also the change in attitude towards death can be very profound for a variety of reasons. The most compelling one is often a sense of not fearing death anymore, because if you believe you're going to be reunited with someone you love, or that you'll get to see them again, then it almost is a welcome kind of phenomenon. Like, you look forward to that day when you will reunite with them. It'll be a great reunion. So it could take the sting of death away. On the other hand, sometimes there's a lot of fear around death for the remaining loved ones. So it might be that you've lost a parent and now you're terrified of losing your spouse, because you know that loss can happen at any moment. And that's a process to be worked through, basically, that knowing that death can come, you can allow it to terrify you, or you can allow it to heighten your sense of the now, heighten your sense of the moment, so that you can really appreciate and be grateful for every single moment. Because most people are in a kind of trance. They're in a little bit of a sleepwalk, where they're just sleeping through the days, and they're rushing around, and they're stressed, and they're missing the miracles of their lives. So if you can use your fear and channel it in a way that gets out of the fear side and more into the urgency side of just, this is it, the miracle is right now, it's happening right now, and I'm enjoying it, so that at least when you or your partner or anyone else you know love leaves the planet, because it will happen, you won't have the regret of saying, "Wow, I just missed the whole thing, hardly noticed it." You'll say, "I savored it, I appreciated it, I was right there with it, and there's not a single regret for me." So that's the kind of attitudinal shift where your grief can kind of blow the dust off of the days remaining and wake you up.
Yeah, I know I could strongly say that was my experience as well. You aren't fearful of anything anymore, because you're like, oh, the worst has happened, So yeah, it gives you a new courage.
That's right. it gives you courage. See, that's wonderful. And you're saying that courage is a direct result from having had your loss.
Correct, yeah, because the worst has happened. What else could happen? Nothing. So, yeah.
That's right. That's right. So that's a perfect example of transcendence. And it doesn't have to be, again, sort of a huge event where the earth shakes. It's a subtle thing that you have now, that you have more courage in your life and in your heart, that you've had a shift in the way you relate to things. You have nothing to fear because the worst thing happened. And so there's kind of a fearlessness for you. And, and I don't know how hard you had to work for that fearlessness, because the truth is some people naturally transcend. Just like some people are naturally a little more optimistic, and some people are naturally more extroverted, or just naturally more happy. We have happiness set points. So it could be that some people just naturally transcend. They see something happened. What am I going to do with it? They take the lemons, they make the lemonade. They don't even have to think too hard about it. And other people, for whatever reason, have to struggle a little more. They have to work for it. They have to fight for every little ounce of optimism. And so I just want to acknowledge that, because for some people it just really is a more natural, organic, easy, effortless experience, and other people, they have to fight for every step forward. But that doesn't mean they can't do it. And so that's the good news, is that, even introverts can push to be extroverted, depressed people can push to be less depressed, people who naturally worry can work to worry less. Because of neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to change in response to experience, there's really no excuse. There's no excuse to just say, I'm just a bitter, closed, shut down person. That's the way I am, and that's the way it is. I can't change it. Wrong. You can change. You can't completely change your nature, let's say, but you can certainly push to your edge. And everyone has the ability within them to start choosing transcendence, even when it's difficult.
And as far as, how we can change our brain patterns, how you're saying there's no excuses, how would someone apply that who's more in the early stages of grief? Is it more like thinking like I am statements or affirmations, or what's like a successful way when you're really, I know you're in your true mourning, your true grieving, but what's a successful way to kind of help you kind of see, okay, good, I'm going to get through this, like to train your, I can get through this. Like, what do you suggest?
Well, I think that's a great question, because in the early stages, you may not be totally prepared for the kind of transcendence that comes later. But that said, there are still things you can do. And one really important subtle shift, I think, is to say to yourself, and this is kind of a affirmation or a mantra, this is how I feel today. I don't know how I'm going to feel tomorrow. So a sense of really honoring, because you may be feeling today, especially if the loss has been recent, I'll never get over this, I'll never feel joy again, I'll never smile again, I'll never feel love again. But that's how you feel today. And you don't know how you're going to feel in 5 weeks, in 5 months, in 5 years. You just don't. So you have to open the possibility that I will likely feel different later, but this is how I feel today. And that way you kind of you chunk it down into a smaller piece instead of globalizing it, instead of saying, this is how I'm going to feel forever. I can never imagine not feeling this way. And, of course, that's kind of how you feel. It's like when you get the flu and you just feel dreadful and you think, I don't even know what it feels like to be well. I can't even remember, and I'll probably feel like this forever. but to remember that this is how I feel today, and this too will pass, or this too will change, this too will evolve. And in fact, it will evolve in ways I can't even predict because I have no idea what I'm going to feel like in a year. So I think that's an important recognition, because so often the feelings are so overwhelming that you can't imagine feeling any other way. The other, I guess, advice I would say for grievers is let the process evolve. So instead of trying to force yourself to transcend, say, oh, it's been 3 months, I've got to transcend. No, if you're not in that place yet, let yourself be where you are. You can't force it to be spring when there's snow on the ground. And you can't force yourself to go dancing if you have a broken leg and your leg's in a cast. So you have to allow for the healing process to be doing its work. And ultimately, we really are resilient beings. That is our nature, to be resilient, to adapt to change, to adapt to trauma. It's how we're built to be. But you have to, like anything that needs healing, whether it's a broken limb or, as I mentioned, the flu, some things just have to kind of run their course before you can see how it's all shaking down. So there's a simultaneous especially in the early part of grief, a simultaneous holding of this is how it is, I have to go through this, I have to feel this, while also holding out the possibility that I won't always feel this, not exactly this way, that this is going to change, that this is part of a process, and that one day I'm going to be in a different place.
And I wonder how you mentioned holding out that, yes, I will be in a different place someday. This is part of the process. I wonder how the griever can get themselves to really trust or believe this really is going to happen, because you can tell yourself that, but how do you think you get yourself to, I know you're holding a space for it, but to really believe, wow, that could happen, or what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think it helps to talk to other people who've gone through it and who are a little further along. That sometimes can be helpful. And sometimes it can be helpful to read about that, to read about a process that you see there's sort of light at the end of the tunnel. And sometimes there's just a trust. There's just a trust that all things in life are always evolving and changing, that everything is ultimately impermanent. So you just have to trust that this, like everything else, is part of a cycle and part of a process, part of a chain, and you just have to allow the process to unfold.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful, too, for maybe the person who might be questioning, oh, can this really happen, to see the other people as well. It's almost like evidence, like, oh, if I read, I read this is what other people happen to, oh, look at how much better they're doing. So I think that helps perhaps build the trust.
Yes, it absolutely can. And sometimes that has I guess it's worth mentioning that sometimes that can backfire. If you're in a group, let's say, of people over time who never seem to get better, or they say, wow, it's been 10 years and I'm still as bitter as I ever was, you almost have to take it all with a grain of salt. Look at the people and their lives that you're listening to. So in other words, if you're hearing people way down the line who don't seem to have grown at all, who in fact are worse or more bitter, that doesn't have to be you. Sort of everybody has their own story and their own path, but in general, when you look around at nature is a great teacher, that it's always in cycles. Trees are changing, leaves fall, things go dormant in the winter, things get regenerated in the spring, that life all around us is teaching us about cycles, about movement, about growth, about rebirth, and those are the people and the stories you want to gravitate to, not necessarily people who seem to be so stuck or so immobilized that you think, oh, that's going to be me. It doesn't have to be.
Sure, so kind of be careful with your support group to observe what's really happening with them.
Exactly, and whether you feel A, understood, but B, some hope, that you want both. You want some sense of being understood, and you also want some sense of hope.
Sure. And then tell me, too, like, as someone goes through the transcendence process or, goes farther along on the journey, what have you observed with people's spirituality? Like, how does that change?
Well, I think it definitely does change, and sometimes it goes through kind of like a bow and arrow, where something might go backwards before it goes forward. A lot of people will feel a backward motion to their spiritual lives in that they might feel angry with God. They might feel just that the universe has let them down, that the things they used to believe in no longer seem true. So sometimes there's a sense of a shattering or a sort of breaking down of faith. But then if they can stick with it long enough, if they can explore it, if they can tolerate it, if they can look at other ways and investigate and research and talk to people and sort of stick with the process, my experience is that they get to a different place of deeper faith, of a stronger connection to a higher power, to the universe, to something greater than themselves. It may look less traditional than they imagined. It may not be part of a traditional religion. It may be more nature-based. Obviously, it's different for different people, but it can also be fortified by a sense that their loved one's spirit is still around. And that's another big piece for grievers to know, is that many people feel a connection with their loved ones through spiritual means. Sometimes that's signs through nature, signs through electricity, signs with synchronicity. Could be feel like visitations through dreams. Sometimes it's actual visions. So there could be a whole sense of, wow, there's this whole spirit world out there that I didn't know about that I'm now connecting to. So it can be spiritual in the sense of a higher power, and it can be spiritual in the sense of actual spirits. And that can bring so much comfort when you open yourself to that possibility and then start to receive communications. It can be very validating and comforting.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people who are open to it, they do get a lot of comfort from that. And also I wanted to let everyone know that you wrote an awesome article, because you're a blogger for the Huffington Post, and it's called Grief Intelligence, a Primer. So I would encourage everyone to check that out, because it's really a short article, but you get out such important information.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was an awesome article, I have to say, because it reached so many people. I've written for a couple of years for Huffington Post, but nothing like this article ever got that kind of reach. It had 40,000 likes. It just, wow, it went sort of a viral kind of experience. And because it touched so many people in its truth, that's why I believe it just really spread, because basically I was putting down some of the key points that I've learned in 20-plus years of being a grief counselor, and I just kind of elucidated it in a way that made a lot of sense to people. So I'm really happy that that article got out and helped so many people.
And I think just from our brief time today, you really hit those main points as far as grief really doesn't offer closure. It's a lifelong process. You can stay connected to the deceased, or you recommend people stay connected. You are changed forever, and you can choose to transcend grief. So
that's right. And to remember that love does not die, that physical form does, but love itself does not. And so that's what you want to weave into you and hold on to.
Yeah, and it's just crazy that we're kind of given the message otherwise. So I just want to touch on one last point with you, is how can people really take these principles to heart to give themselves permission when so many people, I I shouldn't say so many, when they get other messages, to move forward, move on, you really need to give yourself permission. So give us your thoughts on how to give ourselves permission.
Well, you've said it. You've got to give yourself permission and trust your intuition, and to trust that what you're experiencing is true for you. So if someone says, "Oh, you need to cut your attachment to them," but you know that you don't want to. You don't want to cut your attachment to that person. How horrible. You want to talk to them. You want to write to them. You want to look at their picture. So you want to trust your intuition of what you already know is true. And that's why I actually have a free report that I would love to offer to your listeners, and it's on my website, which is ashleydavisbush.com, and there's a place to click for free reports. I have several available, but if you click the one for grief, it's called You're Not Crazy. 5 normal experiences in the first year of grief. And that's exactly this, to know that you're not crazy, that what you're feeling and what you're intuiting, especially if it's telling you, I need to rest, I need to grieve, I need to cry, I need to remember, I need to talk about them, or I need a break from all this and I need to just go watch a funny movie, because we do need breaks from the grief, and we need distractions, and we need reconnections to fun and lightness. So I tell people, trust your intuition, because chances are that it's guiding you to the right place. Don't listen to people who don't know what it's like to be you or be inside you, because you're not crazy.
Yeah, that's an awesome way to end our call. And I would encourage everyone to visit Ashley's site to get that information. And then, of course, check out the Huffington Post article called Grief Intelligence, a Primer, and Ashley's book, Transcending Loss, Understanding the Lifelong Impact of Grief and How to Make It Meaningful. And I think it will really have a profound effect on anyone who chooses to read it. And Ashley, we thank you for your time today and all the valuable information you shared with us. It was a pleasure.
Well, you're so welcome, and I really appreciate the work you're doing to help grievers and help get the word out, and I'm just really happy to be a part of that effort. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks again, Ashley, and thanks to all our listeners, and everyone, take care.
Bye-bye.